Ladies and gentlemen, let me begin with a statement that changed my life many years ago. Don't wish it were easier. Wish you were better. That right there is the essence of personal development. You see, success is not something we chase. It's something we attract by the person we become. When we examine the trajectory of a successful individual, it's natural to attribute their progress to external forces, luck, timing, or perhaps the right connections. But from a psychological and behavioral perspective, these are merely surface-level explanations. True success is less about pursuit and more about personal alignment and readiness. In clinical and cognitive behavioral terms, the principle is simple. Success is not an external destination you chase. It's an internal state you cultivate until the external world responds accordingly. Imagine a patient suffering from chronic dissatisfaction, dissatisfied with their career, relationships, health. Initially, they believe the solution lies in acquiring more money, a new job, different relationships. They begin to chase things desperately, anxiously, yet their internal environment remains unchanged. Their core beliefs, habits, emotional regulation skills, and self-worth remain neglected. And so even when they do manage to grab hold of what they want, it slips away or fails to satisfy. This is not coincidence. It is cause and effect. As a practitioner, one of the most powerful therapeutic tools is helping individuals understand that their internal condition attracts or repels outcomes. We are magnetic beings, not in some abstract spiritual sense, but in very practical, observable ways. A person who radiates discipline, clarity, optimism, and accountability naturally becomes more appealing to opportunities, employers, partners, and peers. Conversely, a person mired in self-doubt, blame, and emotional volatility repels progress, even if they appear to be pursuing it actively. Let's examine this neurologically. The brain is wired to recognize patterns. If you habitually live in scarcity, fear, or chaos, your brain's reticular activating system filters the world through that lens. You only see obstacles, threats, and excuses. On the other hand, when you develop internally, reading, reflecting, exercising discipline, you rewire your brain to identify opportunities, make better decisions, and persevere. This doesn't mean external success arrives overnight, but it becomes inevitable because your mind, behavior, and biology are aligned toward growth. There's also a physiological aspect. Cortisol levels, sleep quality, posture, breathing. These all affect how others perceive and respond to you. A person who's grounded in personal growth exudes calm, presence, and confidence, not because they're pretending, but because their nervous system has been trained for balance. That's attractive. Not in a superficial sense, but in a deeply evolutionary one. People are drawn to stability, to people who have done the work. So when we say success is attracted, not pursued, we're stating a clinical reality. Chasing implies desperation. It triggers the sympathetic nervous system, fight or flight. It sends signals of scarcity. But attraction comes from a regulated, proactive state, one rooted in clarity, value alignment, and consistent behavior. You aren't hunting success. You're becoming someone success naturally moves toward. In therapy, we often work with people who say, "Nothing good ever happens to me." But upon deeper examination, we find that they've built no psychological structure to receive or retain good things. They're either overwhelmed by self-sabotage or unprepared for opportunity. That's why personal development is critical. It prepares the internal space for external results to land and last. Ultimately, this concept is not motivational fluff. It's behavioral science. It's neurobiology. It's emotional intelligence. It's ancient philosophy confirmed by modern data. When you focus less on chasing outcomes and more on becoming the kind of person who deserves and sustains them, your life changes, not by magic, but by measurable transformation. So if your results are lacking, don't run faster. Pause. Look inward. Then begin the real work, shaping your thoughts, building better habits, taking ownership. Because when you become more, life offers you more. And that's the power of personal development. You attract success by becoming worthy of it. There is a clear distinction between extrinsic labor and intrinsic evolution, between the act of performing tasks for external reward and the act of cultivating oneself for enduring internal strength. In clinical psychology and behavioral science, we refer to this as the difference between performance-based identity and development-based identity. One is fragile, dependent on outside validation. The other is stable, built upon inner growth. This concept becomes especially apparent when we explore the notion that working harder on yourself than you do on your job is not just a motivational idea, it's a psychologically sound life strategy. In therapy, we often meet individuals facing burnout, low self-worth, or chronic stress related to their work. They may be excelling at their jobs, meeting deadlines, and even receiving accolades, yet still feel unfulfilled, anxious, or disconnected from their own purpose. Why? Because their effort is almost entirely directed outward. They are caught in a loop of task performance, constantly doing but rarely becoming. Their professional role has expanded, but their personal growth has stagnated. This imbalance has consequences not only for emotional well-being but for long-term success. When you focus exclusively on working hard at your job, on meeting expectations, achieving quotas, climbing ladders, you begin to outsource your value. Your self-esteem becomes contingent on external approval. This is not sustainable. The moment you experience failure, rejection, or transition, your identity suffers. But when you prioritize self-development, your emotional intelligence, discipline, integrity, health, and mindset, you build internal capital. This kind of capital doesn't erode with a job loss or a market downturn. It's transferable, resilient, and deeply grounding. Consider the concept of self-efficacy, defined by psychologist Albert Bandura as one's belief in their own ability to execute actions required to manage prospective situations. Self-efficacy is not built at work. It's built before work. It's strengthened by how you talk to yourself, how you structure your mornings, how you respond to setbacks, and how you invest in lifelong learning. These habits are part of personal development, and they influence not only how well you perform in your job, but how you experience it. From a neuroscientific lens, personal development activates the prefrontal cortex, the region of the brain responsible for executive function, decision-making, impulse control, planning, and goal setting. When this region is well developed through reflective practices like journaling, reading, mindfulness, or strategic thinking, individuals are better equipped to handle stress and make thoughtful decisions. This in turn makes them more effective, not just at work, but in every domain of life. Physical health also plays a role. People who develop the discipline to eat mindfully, exercise regularly, and prioritize sleep tend to have better cognitive performance and emotional regulation. These attributes are not tied to a job description, yet they directly impact how one performs professionally. In short, the sharper your personal foundation, the greater your professional output. There is also a therapeutic truth here. The more you invest in becoming, the less you fear losing. A person who has cultivated character, resilience, and knowledge doesn't panic in times of uncertainty. They adapt. They create. They recover faster because their sense of self is not married to one identity or role. They are not defined by their job. They are defined by their capacity to grow. When patients report feeling stuck or undervalued professionally, one of the first interventions is to shift the focus inward. Instead of asking, how can I get more recognition, we ask, who do I need to become to attract better opportunities, and how can I start that work today? This reorientation is not only empowering, it's healing. In sum, working hard on yourself is not optional if your goal is sustainable success. Your job may provide income, but personal development provides freedom. Freedom from fear, from dependency, from stagnation. And in that freedom you find not only success, but deep and lasting fulfillment. In therapeutic and behavioral frameworks, one of the most consistent truths is that the outcomes we receive in life are not proportionate to what we need, but to what we have prepared ourselves to deserve. This distinction, though subtle on the surface, has profound psychological and practical implications. Many individuals in both clinical and everyday settings struggle with a form of cognitive dissonance. They desire outcomes, better health, financial abundance, meaningful relationships, without having laid the inner foundation to hold or sustain them. In essence, they are emotionally and mentally under-equipped for the very success they long for. Clinicians often encounter this phenomenon in the form of entitlement-based thinking. A client might say, "I've been through so much, I deserve happiness." While the sentiment is valid on a human level, from a behavioral science perspective, the reality is more complex. Life, society, opportunity structures, outcomes is not calibrated to respond to past pain or present desire. It responds to preparation, competence, and alignment. This is not cold. It's not harsh. It's behavioral cause and effect. When we speak of deserve, we are not invoking morality, but psychological readiness. In cognitive therapy, deserving is tied to self-efficacy, internal locus of control, and goal-oriented behaviors. Let's take the example of financial success. A person may feel they deserve wealth because they work hard or have experienced hardship. But unless they develop financial literacy, emotional regulation around spending, and strategic thinking, money, if it does arrive, will vanish. The outcomes were never the issue. The issue was the lack of developmental structure to support them. Similarly, in relationships, someone may say, "I deserve love." From a therapeutic standpoint, we acknowledge that all people are worthy of connection. However, we must ask, are you the kind of person capable of sustaining love? Do you communicate clearly, set boundaries, resolve conflict, and show empathy? Without these capacities, love may enter your life, but will quickly become destabilized. The emotional architecture does not yet support the weight of the desired outcome. From a neurological perspective, this dynamic is tied to habit loops, reward systems, and dopamine conditioning. When people are conditioned to expect reward simply for wanting, they bypass the developmental process that builds the prefrontal executive functions responsible for delayed gratification, planning, and accountability. This often leads to frustration and helplessness, especially in adulthood, when real-world outcomes begin to mirror internal inconsistencies. In therapy, a major goal is helping clients move from need-centric thinking to growth-centric action. We ask not, "What do you want?" but "What are you doing every day to become the kind of person that reality rewards with that result?" This shift is transformative. It dissolves helplessness and replaces it with agency. One of the most powerful exercises we do with clients is called identity matching. We explore the traits, habits, mindset, and behaviors of someone who naturally receives the outcomes they desire. Then we ask the client to honestly assess, am I becoming this person? Or am I just wishing to skip to the reward? More often than not, the gap is in preparation, not in value. This insight, life responds to deserve, not need, is not meant to be discouraging. On the contrary, it's deeply empowering, because it means that no matter your background, your pain, or your past failures, you can still qualify yourself for greater outcomes through intentional personal development. The door is not closed. It just requires a different key. So instead of waiting for circumstances to change, we shift inward. We build character. We develop discipline. We master emotional intelligence. We read. We reflect. We act. Over time, life adjusts, not because it owes us, but because we've become the kind of person it consistently rewards. That is the path of transformation, to evolve from merely needing something to earning it, not through struggle alone, but through thoughtful, disciplined growth. Human behavior is not driven by grand moments of inspiration, but by small, often invisible patterns repeated consistently over time. This is not merely a philosophical insight, it is a clinical reality supported by decades of psychological research. In the domain of cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, we emphasize the power of micro-habits, or small actions that may appear insignificant, but when repeated, rewire thought patterns, reshape emotional responses, and eventually alter life outcomes. The idea that small disciplines create big results is not just motivational rhetoric, it is a cornerstone of sustainable personal transformation. Patients who struggle with motivation, procrastination, or self-sabotage often believe that massive change requires massive effort. They wait for the perfect time to overhaul their routines, tackle all their goals, or fix deeply rooted problems in one sweeping gesture. Unfortunately, this all-or-nothing mentality is a cognitive distortion that often leads to overwhelm, paralysis, and eventual relapse into old habits. In clinical settings, we counter this by teaching the principle of incremental change. Progress is not a single leap, but a consistent series of intentional steps. Consider the neurobiology behind habit formation. The basal ganglia, a region in the brain responsible for habit loops, does not differentiate between large or small behaviors. It simply encodes repetition. This means whether you meditate for 30 minutes or simply sit quietly for 2 minutes a day, your brain begins to carve neural pathways that reinforce calmness, focus, and emotional regulation. Over time, these pathways deepen, making the behavior more automatic and less mentally taxing. This is how small disciplines create permanent shifts. In clinical practice, we apply this principle through behavioral activation strategies. For example, a depressed patient who cannot find the energy to clean their home might begin by making the bed every morning. This seemingly minor act creates a sense of order, agency, and accomplishment. Over days and weeks, this tiny routine becomes a keystone behavior, one that creates a psychological ripple effect, leading to larger changes in hygiene, time management, and emotional state. The key is not intensity, but consistency. This principle also applies to emotional and relational health. A client who struggles with conflict avoidance doesn't need to suddenly master assertiveness. They might start by speaking one honest sentence per conversation, or by simply maintaining eye contact during disagreement. These are small disciplines, but they build self-trust. They teach the nervous system that discomfort is survivable, and they gradually increase the individual's tolerance for vulnerability. Over time, such micro-adjustments foster profound emotional resilience and authenticity. The same applies to intellectual and professional development. Reading 10 pages of a meaningful book per day, journaling for 5 minutes each morning, or writing a single paragraph toward a long-term goal may not feel like enough in the moment, but clinically, these actions serve to reinforce a growth mindset, a belief that progress is always possible, and that personal evolution is within the individual's control. These tiny efforts accumulate, not just in outcomes, but in identity. The person begins to see themselves as disciplined, intentional, and capable. What's critical to understand is that small disciplines also carry symbolic weight. Each time an individual follows through on a micro-commitment, they send a message to their subconscious, I can trust myself. That trust becomes the foundation for long-term behavioral change. It is also deeply therapeutic. Many clients, especially those with trauma histories, have experienced repeated self-betrayal, promises made and broken, goals set and abandoned. By establishing and maintaining small, sustainable habits, they rebuild the broken bridge between intention and action. In sum, personal transformation does not arrive like a lightning bolt. It is cultivated like a garden, quietly, patiently, and with daily attention. Small disciplines are not insignificant. They are the structure upon which a meaningful life is built. And over time, they yield results that are not only visible but deeply enduring. This is not optimism. It is behavioral science, and it works. When discussing long-term behavioral change and psychological resilience, one principle consistently emerges from both clinical experience and empirical research. Personal development is not an isolated event, but a daily practice. This concept is critical in therapy because many individuals approach growth with a burst-driven mindset, seeking transformation through weekend seminars, inspirational books, or temporary lifestyle overhauls. While such experiences can spark awareness, they do not, in isolation, lead to sustained change. From a therapeutic perspective, what truly transforms lives is the regular engagement in conscious, structured self-improvement over time. Consider the cognitive mechanisms behind this idea. The human brain is highly plastic. It adapts continuously based on what it encounters regularly. But neuroplasticity favors consistency over intensity. A single intense workout does not change the body. Likewise, a single motivational moment does not alter a self-defeating belief system or rewire a trauma response. For change to occur at the level of neural structure and identity, it must be integrated into daily routines. This is where many individuals falter. They underestimate the power of repetition and overestimate the power of occasional effort. In clinical therapy, particularly in modalities such as cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, and dialectical behavior therapy, DBT, we assign small daily tasks, gratitude journaling, thought records, mindfulness minutes, not because they are groundbreaking in themselves, but because they teach internal discipline and emotional regulation through repetition. Over time, patients begin to notice that these seemingly minor daily activities shift how they think, feel, and act. The brain doesn't respond to what you intend to do. It responds to what you actually do, regularly. One common therapeutic intervention involves helping patients build what we call keystone habits, routines that act as anchors for other positive behaviors. These could include waking up at the same time each day, exercising for 10 minutes, meditating for 5, or preparing a healthy meal. These habits are intentionally small because small actions lower resistance. But what's more important is that they occur daily. This daily engagement creates psychological momentum and a cumulative sense of self-efficacy, the belief that one can influence their own outcomes. We also see the emotional implications of this approach. When patients only engage in personal development during emotional highs, after a crisis, during New Year's resolutions, or following external validation, they link growth to instability or external pressure. This reinforces a reactive, rather than proactive, relationship with self-improvement. But when personal development is woven into daily life, like brushing teeth or preparing food, it becomes a baseline behavior, a non-negotiable aspect of one's identity. This consistency stabilizes mood, reduces reactivity, and strengthens self-trust. From a physiological standpoint, daily practices regulate the autonomic nervous system. Activities like mindfulness, journaling, movement, and reflection, when performed consistently, help shift the nervous system from a chronic fight-or-flight state to one of calm engagement. Over time, the body begins to feel safer and the mind becomes more focused. This enhances learning, decision-making, and emotional flexibility. Again, the emphasis is not on the magnitude of the practice, but its frequency and reliability. In long-term therapy, one of the most telling signs of recovery and growth is not dramatic insight, but quiet consistency. When a client begins to show up each day for themselves, not just in sessions, but in how they treat their body, organize their time, or speak to themselves, we know that change has taken root. This kind of stability allows for deeper emotional processing, more resilient relationships, and a richer sense of purpose. In conclusion, personal development is not a single event that flips a switch. It is a series of daily decisions that gradually redefine who you are and what you believe you're capable of. The power is not in the scale of the effort, but in its consistency. In therapy, in life, in every dimension of human growth, the daily practice is the cornerstone of sustainable transformation. When we evaluate patterns of personal dissatisfaction, stagnation, or repeated failure, we often find that individuals are directing a significant portion of their energy outward, toward changing circumstances, influencing other people, or controlling external events. This tendency, while understandable, is ultimately misaligned with how true and lasting change occurs. From a clinical and therapeutic standpoint, one of the most fundamental principles of growth is that transformation begins internally. You cannot sustainably change the world around you until you first change the world within you. In psychology, this principle is reflected in the concept of internal locus of control, the belief that you have power over your own outcomes through your behaviors, thoughts, and decisions. Individuals with a high internal locus of control tend to be more resilient, proactive, and emotionally stable. They see themselves not as victims of circumstance, but as agents of change. By contrast, those with an external locus often fall into patterns of blame, helplessness, and chronic dissatisfaction. They wait for others to improve, for the environment to shift, or for luck to deliver something different. This mindset is not only disempowering, it is clinically associated with depression, anxiety, and a diminished sense of agency. In therapy, one of our primary goals is to help clients redirect the focus inward, not in a self-critical way, but in a reflective, constructive manner. We ask questions like, what part of this situation can you control? or what belief is contributing to this emotional reaction. These inquiries help clients realize that while they cannot always dictate external outcomes, they can absolutely manage their internal response systems. And in doing so, they begin to transform their lived experience. Neurologically, this process engages the prefrontal cortex, the brain's executive center responsible for decision-making, impulse control, and emotional regulation. As clients develop greater self-awareness and self-discipline, they become less reactive and more intentional. This shift not only improves their inner emotional world, but inevitably alters how others respond to them. They become calmer, clearer, and more grounded, and this has a ripple effect on relationships, work dynamics, and daily stressors. Let's take interpersonal conflict as an example. Many individuals enter therapy believing that their relational pain is caused by the other person's behavior. While this may be partially true, sustainable healing only begins when the client examines their own triggers, patterns of communication, and boundaries. They learn to regulate their nervous system during conflict, express needs clearly, and disengage from codependent cycles. These internal changes often produce external improvements, not because the other person changed, but because the client restructured their emotional responses. Similarly, when it comes to career dissatisfaction, people often blame external limitations, bad leadership, market conditions, lack of opportunity. While these factors are real, focusing on them exclusively leads to paralysis. In contrast, clients who begin developing new skills, networking intentionally, or shifting their mindset about value and contribution often find new doors opening, not magically, but because they became someone different in the process. Their external world adjusted to match their internal evolution. The same applies to physical health. Patients often want a quick fix, a diet, a pill, a program, but lasting wellness arises from identity-level change. Seeing oneself as someone who is disciplined, who values their body, who makes choices in alignment with long-term well-being. Once this internal identity solidifies, behaviors follow naturally. The world, including one's body, begins to reflect this deeper shift. Ultimately, the belief that change starts within is not just a moral or motivational statement. It is a therapeutic and neuropsychological fact. The external world is a mirror, and until we adjust what's happening internally, that reflection remains unchanged. But the moment we begin the work of inner transformation, cultivating emotional intelligence, personal integrity, discipline, and self-awareness, we initiate a feedback loop that reconfigures our entire life. Change yourself and your world cannot help but follow. This is the essence of personal development, and it is the foundation for any real lasting transformation.